Everyone, welcome to the Cornell Contemporary China Initiative lecture series. My name is Alan Carlson. I'm an associate professor in the government department here at Cornell and the director of the Chinese Asia Pacific Studies, or CAPS program, and it's my honor to be hosting this lecture series this year. I'd like to begin briefly by thanking the East Asia program for their support of the CCCI series. It's been an ongoing set of talks we've done for a number of years now at Cornell that have been well received, and I think really have added to the discussion of China here in Ithaca. In addition, I'd like to thank the donors, the main donors to CAPS, Michael Zach and Brittany and Adam Levinson, for their support of the program. The CCCI lecture series this fall began with a seemingly simple question: what is China? It hinges on the concept that answering such a query can only be accomplished through addressing a set of additional questions, such as, what are the constraints of thinking of China as being codeterminate with the PRC? What spaces open up if we critically engage the almost naturalized tendency to do so? What practices are employed by states and people to give meaning to the construct of China and to determine who belongs within its borders and who is outside its territory? Our speakers, beginning with Barbara Demick last month, who many of you listened to as well, demonstrate that such questions necessarily also touch upon what is not China. In making such a turn, they address some of the most pressing and significant political and social issues now facing China and the rest of the world. The second of our speakers in the series is James Millward of Georgetown. He'll be followed next month by C.K. Lee of UCLA and Shelley Rigger of Davidson. All talks, as you can see, are online and they're open to everyone, so please register for the future talks and tell your friends. As for today's talk, James Millward is professor of intersocietal history at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. His areas of research include the Qing Empire, the Silk Road, Eurasian lutes and music and history. You can see a few of those in the background. And by the way, Jim also plays many of these instruments. I've had it's been fun to hear him a few times late in the evening. As for today, focusing also on historical and contemporary Xinjiang. His publications are many, most significantly Eurasian Crossroads, A History of Xinjiang, which first came out in 2007 and is being republished this year. I'm assuming this is a significantly revised version. He's written in all the top academic journals and also has contributed op-eds on contemporary China to outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, Los Angeles Review of Books, et cetera, et cetera. Frankly, he's one of the world's leading experts on the history of Xinjiang and Central Asia, and has been at the forefront of ongoing discussions of the assimilationist turn in Chinese policies in Xinjiang since 2017. Jim is someone I've known for a long time. No pressure, Jim, but the expectations here are high. The title of your talk is Decolonizing Chinese Historiography with special attention to Xinjiang. Jim, welcome, albeit virtually, to Cornell.
Thank you very much, Alan, for that introduction and for inviting me. I'm debuting a paper I've been working on for a while. I wrote it actually just before COVID began, and was supposed to deliver it as a keynote somewhere, and that event has now been canceled twice. So I've been kind of playing around with this for, as I said, some time. And so you're getting kind of, some of the ideas in the first draft. I won't have time to do all of them, but I'll try and give you a sense of the whole and then drill in on what I think are kind of some of the more interesting parts if I can. And so let me go to some slides that I have here. Here we go. So are you seeing a opening slide, Alan?
Yes. Not a problem.
All right. So this is a shot of what's called Red Square at Georgetown University. It's a brick square under one of the main teaching buildings there. This is from the August of 2019 or September of 2019. As you can see, someone wrote "Stop Police Brutality, Stop Political Arrests." This was around the time of the Hong Kong demonstrations. And then someone else came in underneath, I'm assuming it's someone else, and wrote "Hong Kong belongs to China." And there are some other slogans written in chalk on this square as well, making it clear that this was about Hong Kong. Now, I was really struck by just this little exchange right in front of you here, because in a way, in a bumper sticker length, it really sort of sums up what is really the same kind of response in official PRC narratives to criticism of policies, particularly with regard to Tibet or Xinjiang or Hong Kong in this case, or perhaps even Taiwan, or to non-Han peoples sometimes. And this response goes to immediately this idea of belonging, possession, or sovereignty, over whatever place is under consideration at this point. And it's really very similar to the response that we see in official white papers, which are often released right at the moment when there is international criticism of some policies with regard to a non-Han people or a peripheral part of the PRC. This was one released in November 18 regarding Xinjiang, of course, when all the information about the camps and birth suppressions and incarcerations of hundreds of thousands of people and so on had come out about Xinjiang. And of course, those of us who work in the China field on these sorts of issues are very familiar with the, Zigu Yilai, Xinjiang ru Zhongguo zhi Bantu, right? Since ancient times, Xinjiang has been part of China. And there's a slight variation on that in this white paper, mentioning and stressing this sort of multicultural aspects of Xinjiang, the many different cultures there, but they're an inseparable part of Chinese culture in bold type. And then when we get down a little bit into the historical summary, the Western Han united Xinjiang, right? And again, this is very familiar to any of us who've worked on these areas. This is how the narrative goes, and it goes back to the earliest point of ownership or sovereignty, of China, of whatever place we're talking about. So we can call this the X belongs to China argument. And I've always been struck by this. Again, it's very familiar, but this time when seeing the exchange in Red Square at Georgetown, I was struck by what a non sequitur it actually is, right? Because there's global criticism of a particular policy or set of policies going on in Xinjiang, and then the response is Xinjiang belongs to China, or Hong Kong in that exchange. But it's the same response. Xinjiang belongs to China on this, and I think it's a non sequitur for a few reasons. First of all, the response to the criticism is really the response to the wrong question, because generally no one is challenging sovereignty of Xinjiang or even of Hong Kong. Maybe some of the Hong Kong demonstrators, were pushing up against that, but the main voices in Hong Kong were not claiming that Hong Kong was a separate country. And that's not necessarily what the international community, it's generally not what the international community is saying about Xinjiang or Tibet either. So in a way, it's a response to a question that hasn't been asked. And also, the second problem with this is sovereignty or ownership in and of itself doesn't give a state a right to abuse its citizens, right? And simply saying that in response to criticism and policies that a particular region is sovereign, again, doesn't answer the question. And I call this sort of the wife beater defense, right? If someone says, stop beating your wife, and then I say, she's my wife, I'll beat her if I want to, right? That's the logic of this kind of X belongs to China sort of response. But there's a third thing that's striking about that non sequitur response, and that's really the subject of what I want to talk about today. And that is what, sorry, lost between my screens here. So that's what I want to talk today. And this argument that such and such a territory about which there are human rights complaints that it belongs to China. The argument depends on a peculiar and very idiosyncratic way of looking at Chinese history, and even an exceptionalist way. It's a completely normalized paradigm that we really all use. It's one that's embedded in every China 101 course. It's structuring all the textbooks. You find it in television documentaries and other kind of more popular portrayals of the Chinese past. It's in maps that we use to illustrate our discussions. It's in charts, it's in timelines, and it's in the very language, the very terminology that we use to talk about Chinese history, and in fact, the language that we make students memorize. This paradigm treats China, something we call China, as a metaphysical entity that's unconstrained really by space and time. China is seen as occupying places even at times when it didn't, as continuing to always be China, even when the avatars of China, what we call the dynasties, even when these dynasties were competing states locked in bloody struggles to destroy each other. In some more extreme versions of the paradigm, this timeless China has forever occupied the territory that is now comprised by the maximal extent of the Qing Empire and the PRC today, or even beyond that if we include the 9-dash line in the South China Sea, which is now claimed as historical patrimony in China. And in this argument as well, the concept of Chinese people has forever incorporated all of the peoples who live now or who ever have lived within the 20th century and 21st century territory of the PRC plus Taiwan. But always in that past, it's the Han people or the Chinese people who have been the majority within that territory. And everyone else, other peoples, are called minority Minzu, even when you're going back to the Bronze Age and archaeological findings like this. So that's what I call this paradigm of continuous of political unity and political continuity since ancient times. Now, in the PRC, this narrative didn't used to assert necessarily that peoples were all racially linked. In the early 20th century, some nationalists and the Guomindang did initially claim that all of the peoples of China, and there they were talking about the five peoples, the Han, Manchu, Mongol, Tibetan, and Tatars or Muslims. They did claim that they were racially linked. Chiang Kai-shek made that claim, but that wasn't part of PRC framing of this issue until recently. Because lately I've been seeing in some of the new uses of this concept of Zhonghua as a kind of super Minzu, I've been seeing some hints of racialization of this discourse of Chinese continuity. So if you can see this is a statement from Xi Jinping, a recent speech by Xi Jinping, September 2020, so a year ago or so, at the Xinjiang Central Work Forum. And this is he used a phrase here that's been used since at least 2018. And you say I put it in blue. It's the second part of that sentence where he says that every Minzu of Xinjiang, or every nationality or ethnic group of Xinjiang, is a family member linked to Chinese bloodlines. So it's this word xuemai, or bloodlines here, and the idea of family membership that kind of hints at a racial idea that's beginning to creep into this unity narrative. All right, so this narrative, is very familiar to China specialists. It's teleological, it's nationalistic. As such, in a way, it's similar to most national histories of any place, right? All of those tend to tell a unified story, teleological story about whatever modern nation we're talking about. And what this narrative does is it gives us, we talk about a continuous political entity called China, even when it's clear that there wasn't such a continuous political entity, but rather many different monarchies of different types with different names, different rulers. The rulers were from different ethno-linguistic groups and located in different places in what is now China, some in the north, some in the south, some occupying larger territories, some occupying quite small territories. one of the most salient contradictions within this story is the issue of what are sometimes called alien or conquest dynasties, such as the Khitan Liao, the Jurchen Jin, the Mongol Yuan, the Manchu Qing, right? And if you think about it, it's a fairly bizarre oxymoron, right? Because these are non-Chinese, right? Clearly identified as such, and yet they are Chinese dynasties. So they're simultaneously Chinese and alien. And even though most scholars now don't talk about Sinicization the way we used to several decades ago, as this kind of magic assimilative force that always happened to conquerors, in particular research on the Qing Empire in recent decades has really shown that not to have been the case with the Manchus. But so even if we don't accept Sinicization as a real thing, as a real empirical historical phenomena that happened, nonetheless, we still include all of these so-called alien dynasties or conquest dynasties in our lineup that we call Chinese dynasties. So I'm not at all saying that the Liao, the Jin, the Yuan, the Wei, the Qing, or other so-called alien states are not part of Chinese history. I'm saying that they are. But precisely because of their role in this story, it's abundantly clear to me that Chinese history cannot be a story of political continuity and ethno-national homogeneity across all the millennia, but rather it's a story of interactions, often adversarial, among a panoply, a large group of territorially and ethnographically diverse states across a vast geographical canvas. And as such, this story then is actually not so different from that of Europe or from that of the Islamic world, or the Islamicate, as it's called by world historians, including in the Middle East, but also Central Asia. So from that realization and realizing that we are talking as if something that was not politically continuous is politically continuous, I'm wondering where that approach comes from and how is it that we still continue to talk about it, even though it seems quite obviously not to have been the case. And I see these problems, or the reasons we talk in this way, arise from some paradigmatic concepts in Chinese historiography and are reflected in and also arise from a lot of the terminology they use. So I'll talk mainly today about some of these paradigmatic concepts. And I'm going to start here with something that should be familiar. I've already mentioned Sinicization, and that kind of goes together with a couple other concepts. One of those is the tribute system or the tributary system. Another one is this idea of a Tianxia realm, and in which the politics worked differently than in other parts and other places of the world. Now, a lot has been written about this bundle of concepts already, particularly the idea of the tribute system. And so I'm not going to talk too much about it. There's a lot of articles from 20 years ago and even more recently that have really challenged it as this key concept, challenging using it as a key concept in our study of China from many angles. And again, as I mentioned before, recent work on the Qing Empire, the so-called New Qing history, has really challenged this and shown that none of these ideas really are empirically the case, or if they are, they're representations of an ideological norm, an ideological worldview, rather than a real world order. But nevertheless, these ideas are still very much with us, particularly the idea that through the tribute system, China, and here we're generally talking about early modern and modern China, so Ming and Qing empires, this idea that China managed its international relations of East Asia in a peaceful way, and that China never expanded militarily. So one example of a recent way in which this concept popped up was in a interview by Gary Locke, then US ambassador to China, on the Charlie Rose show. And he made this comment: if you look at their histories, meaning China, they've never really been a country that tried to invade or go way outside their borders. So again, this is not a surprising statement. You hear this kind of thing fairly often. It's a concept which has sometimes been called, the notion of Confucian peace, right? And you still hear it referred to. Political scientists are fond of looking at the tributary system as potentially a way of managing international relations that was different from how international relations were managed in the West, either pre or post-Westphalian, like this. Let me give you another example of this kind of thing. So this is a quote from a 2019 textbook by Klaus Mühlhahn. And he wrote that the High Qing period was a time of peace and social order, material splendor, cultural refinement, technological progress, and continued territorial expansion. Again, doesn't seem particularly controversial, until you actually look at it closely. It's simultaneously a time of peace and a time of continued territorial expansion, right? Which, if you think about it, makes no sense whatsoever, unless that territorial expansion happened in some sort of magical way, which did not involve military force or threat of military force. And we know, of course, that the Qing did expand through military force and diplomacy and threat of military force, like that. Or I'll choose one more example. This is from Tim Brooke, who I understand will be speaking to you soon. And I have to say, he's a fabulous historian. He's one of our greatest historians of China. And this is from the jacket copy of his book, Great State China and the World. Now, it's a little bit unfair, perhaps, to quote the jacket copy, which is, of course, meant to sell books. But most of these things that I'm looking at here are, their maps, their charts, their textbook materials. This is our top level, the kind of first glance impressions of Chinese history that we as a field are giving out. So in fact, the jacket copy is more important here, I think, than what is, of course, a much more subtle and nuanced approach within the book itself. Anyway, so Brooke writes, or the jacket copy writes here, China is one of the oldest states in the world. It achieved its approximate current borders with the ascendancy of the Yuan dynasty in the 13th century. And despite the passing of one imperial dynasty to the next, has maintained these borders, from 8 centuries since. China remained China through the Ming, the Qing, the Republic, the occupation, and communism. All right, so this is saying that China has maintained its approximate current borders as dynasties pass from one to the next, and China remains China. Now, this is just wrong, right? The Qing Empire was twice the size of the Ming, and it included territory in Inner Asia, which was itself as large as Ming China had been. The Qing spent its first 125 years constantly at war trying to acquire this territory. In the 18th century alone, the Qing fought multiple wars to conquer Mongolia, Jungaria, and Altashar. It invaded Vietnam and Burma, repressed a major rebellion in Taiwan, which it had conquered a century earlier, battled Tibetans in parts of what became Sichuan and Qinghai. The Qing projected cavalry power all the way up onto the Tibetan plateau to repel 2 Nepali invasions. And the Qianlong emperor himself called himself the old man of 10 fulfilled campaigns. So Shiquan Laoren, from these Shiquan Wugong, the 10 great campaigns, to celebrate this record of military adventurism. Right. So this is just 3 examples from an ambassador and from historians who are good historians of how these ideas of tribute system and syncretization and Confucian peace are still very much infiltrating our way of talking about the past, even when the contradictions are right in front of our faces. All right. So I now want to get to what I think is really the big one. So the big paradigmatic issue here. But this is one that's surprisingly been very little noticed in the past. And this is the idea that Chinese history is made up of Chinese dynasties, the periodization of history through Chinese dynasties. This idea that there was a linear succession of dynasties in China is deeply ingrained in our language about Chinese history. And it provides a very convenient periodization, of course. It's not hard to memorize, although there have been inconvenient periods, or there are inconvenient periods such as the Northern and Southern dynasties, the 3 kingdoms, the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms, the 6 dynasties and 16 kingdoms, which, let's face it, these are quite hard, and we all tend to skip these periods because very few specialists remember what all those individual states are under those blanket terms. But this is the periodization of dynasties that orders our textbooks. We put it in charts on the wall. We put it in the end papers of our monographs. And I just want to show you a little video, which is quite fun. This is from some Harvard professors, whom some of you may recognize, and they're going to help us all learn China's major dynasties.
Right. You know, we have a song which we teach in class to help people remember the names of the major dynasties.
Right. It really does help to know which dynasty comes before which.
So we're less concerned with the dates than we are with the chronological order, the sequence of dynasties. Right. Can you sing that song?
I cannot sing it as well as you can.
Well,
shall
we sing it together?
Ni changba.
Only if we sing it together.
Okay.
Zhangzhou Qin Han, Zhangzhou Qin Han, Sui Tang Song, Sui Tang Song, Yuan Ming Qing Republic, Yuan Ming Qing Republic, Mao Zedong, Mao Zedong.
Okay. So I hope you enjoyed that as much as I do. And obviously, this is what it is, right? It's a mnemonic, and as such, it's quite useful. And Peter Bowl and William Kirby are very game for singing the song and sharing it with us. So I have nothing but admiration for them for having for daring to put this out there that way. That said, though, there are a lot of problems with this, and particularly with the way in which the chart is abbreviated. For one thing, it jumps immediately from Han Dynasty to Sui. And in so doing, it misses many of those northern states after the Han and before the Sui, which were, of course, non-Han states, but very important, right? And then, this is the Shenbei period. This is when Buddhism came into China, and so on. And in fact, these families, Shenbei families that were part of the northern dynasties, actually were married into the aristocracy of North China and became part of the Tang aristocracy later on, and so on. So it skips over all of the stuff from Han to Sui. Sui Tang Song, that line telescopes 7 full centuries from 580s through 1279, which likewise contain a lot of smaller states and interesting things which shouldn't be skipped over. And of course, later on, the song skips the Khitan and the Jurchen. Not to mention the Xixia, which, although it's not one of the official dynasties, was nonetheless an important power, and all of which were there at the same time, sharing space in what is now the borders of the PRC with the Song dynasty, right? And so it includes the Song, but it leaves out the Jin, the Liao, and the Xixia states. So I think I shouldn't be spending too much time just criticizing this simple mnemonic, except that it's emblematic of broad systematic problems with the framing and periodization through the dynastic system. And even when we drill into more detail in the dynastic system than we do in this song, ordering our history of China around these famous dynasties does a couple of things. First of all, it highlights polities that were large, polities that were imperial, those that were unified, and highlights those that were Chinese or Han. And so in so doing, it leaves out, obviously, smaller states. It leaves out non-Han states, or many of them. It leaves out periods of time when there were multiple states in a pluralist interstate system in favor of large empires. And so it's introducing, and the dynastic, this idea of a linear dynastic series that we use to structure history introduces imperial bias, size bias, what you could call unity bias, and also Han bias or Han centrism into our structure, how we talk about Chinese states. Now, these are the legible states. These are the legible dynasties, the big ones, the ones that are easily mapped, the ones that are easily put into the charts. But by making those our protagonists, what are we doing? We're erasing and downplaying non-Han polities. We're ignoring very long periods, really, of multiple, diverse, coexisting policies in favor of periods of expansive empires. And so the messy periods get left on the cutting room floor, but that elision is not ethnically neutral, and it's not politically neutral. It's doubling down on a particular vision, a particular normative vision of what the Chinese past should look like: unified, imperial, and mainly Han. All right. So why do we use this word dynasty at all for translating, the Chinese terms Chao or Chao Dai, right? That's the underlying term here. Well, this word dynasty comes from ancient Greek dynasteia, and in Aristotle's Politics, he used it to mean lordship, sovereignty. Sorry, I was just distracted by the chat. I shouldn't be reading it. He meant a power, a regime. And this was the earliest meaning in European languages, namely of a power, of a regime, of a particular sovereignty like that. It was used in one of its earliest uses in English. Dynasty was used in the 17th century by Sir Walter Raleigh, who referred to the histories of the Assyrians, the Trojans, the Italians, and others, etc., as dynasties, so those states as dynasties. By the 18th century, this term already had another meaning in English, and it was being used sort of back and forth in French and English. So both in French and in English, it had another meaning, and that is a succession of rulers of the same line or family, a line of kings or princes. Now there I'm quoting from the OED from the 20th century, the Oxford English Dictionary. And the Oxford English Dictionary says that this meaning, namely of a lineage of rulers or a family line, that this is now the standard definition, that the older meaning of regime is archaic. Now, already back in the 18th century, though, both of these meanings were there and people were arguing over them. So Voltaire had a debate with someone named Pierre-Henri Lachaise over which was the right meaning. And Lachaise said that dynasty means une suite de rats de la même famille, so a line of kings of the same family. And Voltaire said, no, dynastie signifie proprement puissance. Dynasty properly means power. Now today they would have had this as a Twitter debate. In those days, it was in the footnotes of encyclopedia. So we've gotten more efficient in our academic spatting these days. So this is a Google n-gram, and what it does is it charts the frequency of appearance of a word or set of words or terms in the books that Google has scanned. And it's not a perfect measure, but it can also often be a interesting proxy for how words are used. And so you'll see right here in the middle of the 18th century that the usage really picks up, and this is in English. It really picks up like that, through the 19th century. Now, the first text that I was able to find that uses dynasty together in context with China, as opposed to talking about ancient Egypt or Assyria or something like that. The first one that I found was Duhal's General History of China. It was translated into English in 1767. It was written originally in French and published the year before. And it was based on, Duhal wrote this book, which is very influential in the field. He wrote it based on letters written by Jesuits in the Qing court and sent back to France, which he had access to, these edifying letters coming from the Jesuits. And so you see that he numbered them out like this, which I think is interesting. We don't do that anymore. And was applying this word right around the same time that Voltaire and Lacher were arguing over whether it meant a family line or whether it simply meant a regime or a power. Now, there's a lot more we could say about this and sort of how dynasties are used generally. I want to just kind of summarize, though, what I see as the problems with using this notion of dynasty to structure a history of China. And we'll note that we use it as family line, talking about other places. We'll talk about the Habsburg dynasty sometimes, for example, in Europe. But we generally don't use it as a name of a state quite the same way that we do for China. That is very exceptionalist. That's very idiosyncratic to our discussion of Chinese history. And for the reasons that I mentioned before, because of the way we tend to simplify it and focus on the large and the imperial and the Han, this dynasty system ingrains Han centrism, unity bias, size bias, and it's implicitly teleological, while at the same time it elides the non-Han and in particular multi-state periods on the East Asian mainland. And so in this way, it's supporting a nationalist notion of what China should be, that it should be large, it should be unified, it should be under Han rule. And in a way, it's that's quite similar to sort of the manifest destiny idea, I think, in US history or in US historiography. The term dynasty also is clearly Orientalist, right? It was used to talk about Egypt, Assyria, Italy now and then, but English had these sort of views of other places in Southern Europe like this. But in particular, it's used, and even beyond China, where dynasty is used to contrast bad ancient regimes or traditional powers with the modern nation state. And there's been some discussion of this, theoretical discussion of this in European history, a special issue journal that goes into a lot of these kinds of things. So it is one of those old Orientalist terms that is still hung around in the way we talk about China today. And I think that as such, it's impossible to decouple this the term dynasty and naming the different periods of history in China dynasties. It's impossible to decouple that from the idea of the dynastic cycle. And of course, the dynastic cycle is really a ideological or almost kind of quasi-religious idea that there's a great way of heaven which determines the rise and fall of states, that once something reaches its peak, it's going to decline. Once something reaches its nadir, it's going to rise again, and so on. That's not historians today try not to subscribe to these sort of metaphysical notions about great laws of history like this. And in a way, it's kind of funny. Some of you may remember or may have read Paul Cohen's book, Discovering History in China. And that was a very important revision of ways in which people had been talking about Chinese history through the 1970s or so. And I think his book came out in the 1980s. And one of the things he highlighted there was the notion of stagnant China and how that was really wrong. And he also highlighted what he called the tradition modernity dichotomy or dyad. And that we were always using that to structure how we talked about China. And really the idea of the dynastic cycle and this term dynasty, I think, is imbricated in those old-fashioned approaches to Chinese history too. I think Cohen missed this, and he didn't flag dynasty at the time, but in a way it's really, I think, of the same type as those things that he critiqued way back in the 1980s. When we're talking about China as a series of dynasties, this is kind of cycling series of dynasties, we're really still talking about China as caught in this, recursive cycle, the idea of cycling through dynasties without ever really changing and just waiting for modernity, waiting for the modern nation state before real change could happen. And that's a very old-fashioned way of looking at Chinese historiography, and one that we really don't subscribe to anymore. And I guess finally, what's quite important is that the word now, dynasty, really doesn't even mean what it meant when it was first applied to China in European languages in the 18th century. Then I think it's pretty clear that it was being used in the sense of a power, a regime. But now it means a family and not a state, right? So if we were going to use the word dynasty the way we actually use it most of the time in English, we would say that the Li dynasty were the rulers of the Tang Empire, or the Xinjiang dynasty were the emperors of the Qing Empire and expanded into Inner Asia, for example, right? We'd use it for the name of the family rather than for the state. When we confuse ruling lineage for the actual name of the state itself, it creates a false impression, right? As Timothy Brooks' jacket copy said, dynasties pass from one to another, but China remains China, right? It gives this impression that China is this kind of eternal bottle into which new wine gets poured every now and then, poured in, poured out, but the bottle itself stays the same. But we know that ethnically, territorially, in terms of the structure of these states, their size, and so on and so forth, dynasties are really very different from each other in a wide range of ways. All right, so what should we say instead of dynasty? It would be, it will not be easy to extract dynasty, to extirpate dynasty from the way we talk about the Chinese past. I know this, and I'm certainly not telling anybody writing in and working in Chinese that they shouldn't use Chao or Chao Dai, because that is an indigenous term. That is a term with a very long history. It's how people in China have referred to these states for many, many centuries. What I'm saying, though, is that dynasty is itself a bad translation for Chao. And it's bad in certain ways, as I said before, that produce systematically repressive and systematically displacing effects. And I'd add furthermore that this word dynasty, or the translation dynasty for Chao, is actually one of the key words of Chinese history, like barbarian as a translation for yi, or like tribute as a translation for gong, or arguably like the word China itself, which of course is a foreign word that there are many different Chinese words that can be used as equivalent for. These kinds of terms develop in international discourse over the centuries. Lydia Liu has called them supersigns, and she's talked about how they develop in what she calls translingual practice. And they become these keywords, these concepts whereby we talk about the Chinese past, but we really need to scrutinize them a lot more. And we certainly can't accept this 18th century translation as a term we should use forevermore to equate to the Chinese word of Chao. So for now, I suggest the following. I suggest that we should stop calling China-based states dynasties, and we should be more inclusive in the way we deal with non-Chinese states. So don't leave out the Tuoba, don't leave out the Xixia or the Nanzhao or the Altan Khan or other things like this, other states and powers like this, even if they aren't part of the official Daotong, the official lineage of dynasties. They were there. They played important international roles. They played important social and cultural roles. I think rather we should call these states by their names, by the Han, Qin, Tang, Wei, or whatever, and then add an appropriate descriptor of the kind of state that they are. Are they a kingdom? Are they a confederation? Are they an empire? And when you think about that, it actually reveals how much we lose by just calling everything dynasty, because there's a big difference between, for example, the Qi dynasty and the Qing dynasty, right? In types of states that they were. And yet we occlude, we hide all of these differences about political differences and administrative differences and everything else when we just call everything a dynasty like that. So be more specific about the type of state that we're talking about. I think that would be useful. Now, of course, there is great cultural continuity across this entire time period. I'm not saying that the linguistic continuity and even historiographic continuity, right? The model laid down by Sima Qian and the Han Shu, those models were continued in later historical writing as well. So I'm not saying that there was not this cultural ecumen or cultural continuity at China. And it's really raining hard here. I hope you can still hear me okay, because the wind is blowing, rain is pouring down. So I'm not denying that continuity at all. I think we should use China, though, as a geographical marker and Chinese as a cultural descriptor for this real continuity that I'm talking about. And in that sense, it's, again, very similar to the idea of Christendom in Europe or the Islamicate in the Islamic lands. And we could even introduce a term, the Sinicate, so S-I-N-I-C-A-T-E. We could introduce that as a term parallel to the idea of Europe or of Christendom in parallel to the idea of the Islamicate, as a way of capturing this broader cultural zone and the cultural and literary and even in continuity, even in administrative systems, without at the same time implying political continuity across these centuries and millennia. And in that way, the Confucian tradition appears to be, in many ways, quite parallel to the Greco-Roman Judeo-Christian tradition in Europe, or to the Arabo-Persian Islamic tradition in the Islamicate. And it's helpful to distinguish then, as I said, this enduring cultural ecumen from specific polities. All right, so we're getting close to time here, I think, and so I want to wrap up pretty quickly. I'm not going to go into all this, but I just put some of my notes up here so you can kind of see where I'm going with this. When we get into specific terminology, as opposed to the broader concepts I was talking about, some of these issues are familiar already, right? The idea of, so unify, tongyi is a euphemism used in the PRC, mainly for military conquests, such as Xinjiang was unified, and so on. And so obviously we have to be careful in using those kind of terms and being, not being a stenographer for nationalistic and PRC propaganda. We tend to use the RE, the re prefix quite a lot. Reconquer, reunify. And I think we need to think about that, because that, of course, implies that unity is the norm, or that some things were unified before. Xinjiang had not really been part of any China-based state for 1,000 years when the Qing Empire conquered it. So is that a reunification? We have to watch out for, not as that quote from Timothy Brook did, treating China as this kind of immanent spirit that is always there, even when in fact it is not. So you can see what I'm talking about with those kinds of terms. Tributaries, there's issues with that, kind of working in the other way. Sometimes people will assume that tributaries were in fact close vassals to a Chinese state when they weren't. And then this issue of talking about frontiers, borders, borderlands, and peripheries. And here I want to issue a mea culpa here, because some time ago I wrote a chapter about frontier studies. I was talking about the Qing Empire and advocating that we should introduce frontier studies as a way of talking about the Qing. And I still think that's useful. But what I really was somewhat blinded to, I guess, or chose not to do, to a direction I chose not to go in, was really to talk about some of these territories as colonies. In many, many ways, whether we're talking about 20th century, or even if we're talking about the Qing, whether we're talking about imperial conquests, or whether we're talking about settler colonies in which people have been moved or have moved themselves, there's great parallels to colonies elsewhere. And so I think we've really avoided that term far too much in talking about, for example, Xinjiang. There are very strong colonial aspects both to Qing and certainly to PRC rule in Xinjiang. And as I note here, Liang Qichao and Sun Yat-sen both used the term. Sun Yat-sen had a companion book to his San Minzhui, to his Three People's Principles. And this companion book was called The International Development of China. And it was basically a big appeal to international capitalists and other states to invest in the new Chinese Republic, which he was hoping to continue to be the president of. He wrote this in 1922. And there's a whole section there on the colonization of Mongolia and the colonization of Xinjiang, which involves building railroads, as he was, of course, very fond of talking about, and moving Han people out there to open the agriculture. So this simply reminds us that the word colony was not a dirty word 100 years ago. It was used in the United States context as well. Japan embraced it early on and so on. So I think it's certainly reasonable to start talking about Qing borderlands and the acquisition of Xinjiang, Tibet, and other places by the PRC as colonies. And this, of course, again, opens up comparative historical possibilities. All right, so then just to, all right, some other terms, I have another slide, but I won't bother with that. Some other terms that we should be thinking about, terms for people and for peoples, right? So obviously, Minzu is a very complicated word that has multiple meanings that change over time and sometimes even at the same time. If we think about the meaning of Minzu in a term, for example, like, so Minzu is this, I'm sorry, for those of you who might not know Chinese, Minzu is the term we use to translate ethnic, sometimes national. It's a neologism that was put together by the Japanese and then incorporated early in the 20th century and promulgated a lot through the writings of Liang Qichao, actually. But it's been used in many, many different ways. So we have to be very careful about it. And in particular, the term 少数民族, minority nationality, is a political term of art that has been adopted in the PRC, referring to all of the other 55 Minzu besides the Han. And yes, when you are counting within the entire territory of the PRC, then any group who is not Han is a statistical minority. But it is, I think, very problematic to talk about Tibetans, for example, as a minority in Tibet. And if you think about, for example, we talked about the Navajo as an American minority. That would raise some hackles, and we might not feel that comfortable about it. I think this is a similar sort of issue here. So we have to be careful with this minority term. So then what else? Well, then mentioning Navajo brings up the question of indigenes and indigenous peoples. And this is a subject that could easily, we could talk about this for another hour. And so I don't want to get too much into it, although we can talk about it in Q&A if you want to. Some people embrace the term. So some Uyghurs in diaspora embrace the term, some do not. It has particular meanings. It opens some political possibilities for some communities, but it also tends to imply stateless people. And for many people, it's mired in 19th century notions of tribal or primitive peoples. So it's a complex word, but I think we should start thinking about using it more. Of course, Taiwan has embraced the discourse of indigeneity for non-Chinese peoples in Taiwan. Another interesting term, which I won't go into here, but it's the idea of overseas Chinese. Are Sinophone people or people of Sinic descent around the world? Are they all overseas Chinese? Does this diaspora have a expiration date, as the scholar Shi Shumei Shi has asked? All right. So there's a range of these kinds of terms that we could be thinking about, I think. So just to conclude, I think, well, I may be accused of separatism or perhaps of imperialism or of trying to keep China down or trying to balkanize China, or I might be accused of hypocrisy because the US is likewise a colonial power oppressing its indigenous people and non-white minorities, as it absolutely is. That's going to happen. But I want to point out that I'm not telling people working in Chinese language how to talk about China. Rather, I'm concerned with the interpretation and translation issues in the field as it's written in English and other European languages, so far as I'm aware of those other European languages. Just a sort of point there. Those of us who work in English, we tend not to, maybe we read a little French, or maybe now and then read, a primary source in German or something like that. We tend not to read too much sinological writing in European languages other than French and German. I was thinking, when I was talking about these keywords, I was thinking about the word 祖国, right? Which is translated in English, of course, as motherland, right? Well, of course, 祖 means the paternal clan. So it's sort of, how do you get to motherland? One might translate it as fatherland. But of course, if you say fatherland in English, that doesn't sound good at all because of resonances with Nazi Germany, for example, right? So whoever came up with the translation of 祖国 as motherland, this was a good piece of marketing. It was actually a pretty smart translation. But just, I was curious and I looked it up, and in Spanish and Portuguese, and I assume other languages closely related to Latin, 祖国 is in fact translated as patria, because there is no such word as matria, right, in those languages. And so, again, I haven't read widely in other languages, but we shouldn't assume that the English language is entirely hegemonic in setting the terms, and it shouldn't be hegemonic in setting the terms for how other non-Chinese languages talk about this. So there may be room for some interesting comparisons there. Anyway, I think it's important to think about the meanings of these words in translation. And perhaps especially important to think about this question of words such as dynasty or minzu or any of these keywords. And the reason why, another reason why this is important is that sometimes the meanings of the words themselves and the concepts that we use to talk about history are going to be most apparent when we look at them from the precincts of another language, because the very act of having to translate these terms into English makes us have to think about what they mean. And it also makes us realize that they often mean different things at different times in the Chinese record itself. Minzu is, of course, a very good example of that. And so this linguistic, geographical, and political distance gives historians of China outside of China perspective on the normative frames and language of Chinese historiography in Chinese language by virtue of having to translate and compare Chinese terms to those of other historiographies. And now is a critical time for us to use that perspective as comparative advantage to recover and communicate to our readers and students and to Chinese colleagues and to the Chinese Communist Party, PRC state, to communicate to them the great diversity of the East Asian continental past. And to do so from a spirit of trying to contribute to a global joint venture of Chinese historiography. And I think in doing this, we have a responsibility to the past, the present, and also the future. And so I'll stop my formal remarks there.